Hello everyone, welcome back to the YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to tell you one of the most fascinating, unbelievable, and almost crazy sounding stories to come out of wartime history. It's about how a British artist came up with an idea so strange that even military leaders thought it was a joke at first. But soon, this idea ended up confusing German U-boats and helped protect thousands of soldiers and supply ships during World War I. It didn't make ships completely invisible, but it did something smarter. It made them almost impossible to target. In the early 1900s, when World War I broke out, the British Navy was facing a deadly threat. German U-boats, which were powerful submarines, were sinking British merchant ships one after another. These submarines would hide under the water, come close to the surface, and look through a periscope to aim and launch torpedoes. They didn't need to sink the entire British Navy. They just had to destroy the supply ships carrying food, weapons, and soldiers. If they could do that, Britain would eventually starve and lose the war. So the question was, how do you protect ships in the middle of a vast ocean where there's nowhere to hide? At first, the Navy tried painting ships gray or blue so they would blend in with the sea and sky, but that didn't work well. You can't hide a massive metal ship that's hundreds of feet long in a clear open ocean. So the British needed something better, something creative, something no one had ever tried before. And that's when Norman Wilkinson stepped in. He wasn't a scientist or a naval officer. He was a marine artist, basically someone who painted ships and sea scenes for a living. But he understood something important. If you couldn't hide a ship, maybe you could confuse the enemy looking at it. So he proposed a daring and, at that time, ridiculous-sounding idea: paint the ships in bold, eye-catching patterns using black, white, blue, and even bright colors. But instead of painting them to blend in, he suggested painting them in wild, diagonal lines, zigzags, swirls, and broken shapes. This method was called Dazzle Camouflage. The goal wasn't to make the ship disappear. It was to break its shape, hide its direction, and confuse the enemy about its speed and angle. To a submarine captain looking through a tiny periscope, the ship would appear twisted, bent, and hard to understand. Imagine this. You're a German U-boat commander. You raise your periscope and try to calculate the ship's direction to fire your torpedo. Usually, you'd look at the lines and shape of the ship to judge its movement. But now, in front of you is a ship covered in exploding stripes, sharp angles, and distorted shapes. You can't tell if it's turning left or right. You can't even be sure which part is the front and which is the back. And if you fire the torpedo at the wrong angle by even a little bit, it will miss by a long distance. That was the genius of this idea. When Norman Wilkinson shared this concept with the British Admiralty, many people laughed. They thought it was ridiculous to paint warships like floating abstract art. But because they were desperate to stop the U-boats, they decided to try it. And surprisingly, it worked. Soon, hundreds of ships were being painted using Dazzle Camouflage patterns. Each ship had a different design, because if all the ships looked the same, the enemy could learn to recognize them. Artists, painters, and even art students were hired to design patterns. Shipyards were turned into giant art studios. From a distance, these ships looked strange, almost like something from a modern painting. But to the enemy, they were a nightmare. Torpedoes started missing more often. Submarine commanders reported having trouble figuring out the correct angle to fire. And although it didn't completely stop U-boat attacks, it reduced the number of successful hits and saved many lives. What's even more interesting is that this method spread to other Allied countries. The United States Navy and the French Navy also began painting their ships with Dazzle Camouflage. Some of the most famous ships of the time, like the RMS Mauritania, were covered in these bizarre designs. Newspapers started publishing photos of these ships, and people were amazed. Some called them zebra ships, while others thought they looked like floating puzzles. Now, was Dazzle Camouflage perfect? No, it didn't make ships invisible, and sometimes it didn't help at all. Submarines eventually improved their technology with better rangefinders and sonar. But during a time when radar didn't exist yet, and submarines depended mostly on human eyesight, this creative trick worked well enough to make a difference. It bought time, saved ships, and helped the Allies keep their supply lines open. The best part is that this story shows how creativity can be just as powerful as science or weapons. A painter, not a general, not an engineer, came up with a wartime invention that saved lives. It proves that sometimes the most unusual ideas are the ones that change history. Today, many of these original ship designs are preserved in museums and paintings. Even modern artists are inspired by them. So next time someone says art can't make a difference in the real world, remember this story. A brush, some paint, and a crazy idea once stood between life and death in the middle of the ocean. And that is the story of how Dazzle Camouflage made ships almost invisible to U-boats, not by hiding them, but by confusing the enemy who tried to destroy them.